matin, tout le monde. Je m'appelle Willy Blum. Je suis la directrice pour le Québec de l'Institut Broadbent. C'est vraiment un grand plaisir de vous voir aussi nombreux ce matin. Il me fait un grand plaisir de vous présenter notre prochaine conférencière.
It's a great pleasure for me to introduce the next speaker. Christiane Taubira is a politician who reminds us why we get involved. She's an MP from Guyane. She became Minister of Justice from 2012 till January of this year. She was there to organize the law. She's created important progressive reforms of the French Penal Code. In January, she resigned as Minister of Justice because she did not agree with move to take the citizenship away from people responsible of terrorist act. So she has given her final word to ethics and law. So Christiane Taubira is a very inspiring politician through her conviction, through her eloquence and humor, but especially because of her openness and the trust that she has in other people, especially young people. In fact, she does more than give us an example. She reminds us of what makes of us progressive people, and she helps us to keep our convictions. So let us welcome Christiane Taubira. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this warm welcome. I'm exceptionally happy to be with you here today, and I'd like to start by rendering tribute to Ed Broadbent, the founder of this institute, whose work can be seen as being of visionary value, because there's such a great need to rethink progress, to redo the values of the left, to define finally humanism for the 21st century that will allow us to live together, because it's a very urgent cause. So it's with a great pleasure that I accepted the invitation to come speak in front of you. I was hungry to come and see you. I had to cross the ocean to come here, and I knew it would be a pleasure for me to share with you my ideas of these important questions. But to speak also of the French experience, which are useful because of their diversity as well as for what it has in common with what you are living here.
To Ed Broadbent and to congratulate the whole team and the partners. Let me tell you, I should be so glad if I was able to make this address in English. But as I want to be sure that I do understand all I say, I prefer to speak French, if you will allow me. Cet exposé m'a-t-on dit.
I was told that I was given 20 minutes for this talk. It's very little time, but it's a good rule. So I've decided to identify this problem of the responsibility of the left and what that reveals and its link with ethics and the law. First of all, we have to identify what we know. So I went to the historians and philosophers and legal experts, but also to human sciences such as anthropology and social sciences such as sociology. But first of all, let's speak about the left. The left, in history, is linked to social struggles, social victories. The left has as cardinal values the respect of the human being and fraternity as a principle of life in society. The left is linked to emancipation, to equality between all citizens, and with as an objective, social justice. Now, the social or the left has to review its methods of work because it's based on the confrontation of ideas, on debate, on collective discussion, on the critical examination of common action, an action which is generated by this collective discussion. So the left has to redefine its missions because we often forget, especially when the left reaches power, we forget that we are responsible for the most vulnerable, the poorest, the excluded, the marginalized, people who are discriminated against. And we must bring these people up to the level of their own capacity through access to education, knowledge. But we also must bring support, rights, well-being to these people. But beyond all vulnerable people, the left has the responsibility of having towards society an action that will allow society to raise itself up entirely. And our responsibilities, we have direct responsibilities, or by sometime omissions, which bring about rollbacks, defeats. We see an increase in equality. We see increasing gaps in social equality. So we must reflect on this. We, the left, must think of how to redo our vision of the world. And this vision of the world must be based on ethics. When you have only 20 minutes, you don't really have the time to explore the subtle points and nuances between morality and ethics. Of course, philosophers have looked into this. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant proposed analyses that allow us to perceive the nuances between ethics and morality. And 100 years before, Spinoza, a Dutch philosopher, wrote an entire book on ethics and allows us to understand how ethics disalienates us from our passions. But I'd like to use a definition from a French philosopher, Paul Richter, because he forged his conception and his understanding of ethics based on the work of other philosophers, starting with Aristotle, but also with Nietzsche, and the two philosophers I've just mentioned, Kant and Spinoza. Also because his definition seems to me to be clear and respectful of what can be done in public action and in personal behavior and in one's life. So Paul Ricoeur teaches us that the objective of ethics is having a good life with and for other people in just institutions. So we know that ethics is not a list of frozen rules that are absolutes. No, on the contrary. Ethics means that you must constantly search for, and you must interrogate yourself. You must attempt to define what is good, what is fair, what is just, which is not good compared to evil, which is linked to morality, but you have to look for what is good and just. So ethics has for objective rights and standards. When ethics is translated by rules of common living, it's by these standards that we can arrive at ethics. So we talk about standards and not dogmas. But when you speak of rights, the right in the singular with capital letter. First of all, all social responsibilities, all human situations are linked to this word. But we must also recognize its frailty, because rights and the law can be limited, can be reduced everywhere and at any time. So this right is fragile and must be protected. It must be protected because it is at the essence for human rights. It is the essence where we inscribe our individual liberties.
De veiller.
It is therefore our duty to protect that right in the singular, which contains the rights of human beings. We therefore have to be constantly vigilant. But we also need to be able to react diligently each time that somebody's integrity, their freedom, and their rights are threatened anywhere across the world. In any case, we should be able to do that. We should be able to do that because we shouldn't confuse the abstract human and the real person. We shouldn't just be satisfied with the image and the idea while neglecting real people. By the way, that's what Diogenes, I think, said when he left his barrow and was walking around in the street in broad daylight with a light and stating, "I'm searching for man." Because abstract man doesn't exist, and obviously, whether men know it or just learning about it, abstract women do not exist either, and even less so.
Bien après Diogène,
Well after Diogenes and much closer to us in time and in space, we have the great poet Aimé Césaire, who asked us to be attentive, to pay attention to human beings, to concrete people, people who are suffering. And he told us being indifferent is not an option. And Aimé Césaire told us we cannot be indifferent. He said, beware of the sterile attitude of the spectator, because life is not a spectacle. Because when somebody is suffering, well, that is not something that is abstract. When a person is screaming, that is not a bear that is dancing. We have the duty to listen to people who are suffering, people whose freedoms are being threatened, dangers that are threatening others and that could also threaten us. And it's through the law that we should guard against those dangers. And by linking rights and obligations, we can ensure the protection of those values. And we owe that to everybody, because freedom and the integrity, all that is tied to human beings, to human dignity. And they're based on universal values, values that are universal, not because somebody created them somewhere, but they are universal because they are the result of struggles that were led by men and women from all over the world. And these values are universal because they are tied to people's rights. They are inalienable. And that's why we know that we cannot accept that somebody's integrity be tampered with and that people's freedoms be challenged. We cannot accept that people's lives be imperiled, including when national legislation allows it. We know that there is what we call natural rights, which makes it such that in terms of equality and dignity, we have rights, intrinsic rights that flow from our humanity. And that's why these natural rights actually drives international law, and which is customary law. And that's why in international law, there are prescriptions banning corporal punishment, whereas we know that there are national laws that authorize corporal punishment. And we know that there are national laws that ban slavery, whereas we know that in international law, slavery is banned, but in national laws, up to 30 years ago, slavery was still allowed in some national laws. International law is based on human tragedies, and it tells us that we have to codify people's rights in international covenants. What we're asking the international community is not to stop there and to watch over countries that are betraying their signatures and to ensure that those standards are adhered to, because we are all custodians. We are all custodians, and we are there to protect the rights and the freedoms of each citizen of the earth. The history of rights and the history of human beings is the history of a long, slow victory of rules over force. And we have to be very vigilant, because we know, maybe we forgot over the last 20 years, but we know how easy it is to get used to the return to force. So the question now is, what is the intersection area between the left's responsibility, the left with its history, its values, its methods, the responsibility of the left? Where does that intersect with ethics and the law? Well, quite simply, in public action. Through public action led by public authorities, but also in the responsibility that we all have and in the commitments that we might make, political commitments in the partisan sense of the word, as well as union commitments and association commitments. All those commitments enable us to contribute to the revitalization of the values of the left, and in basing the left's values on ethics, and in ensuring that rights codify what the left's values presuppose, so that in the end we can write the book on the humanism of the 20th century. So it is rights which, thanks to our freedoms and our actions, will enable living together. And that's why this right must stay quite up to date and stay awake and watch out for all the perils, and it has to evolve based on additional guarantees that may be necessary. George Bernanos, by the way, did observe that it is not the rules that actually keep us alive. It is us who should be keeping the rules alive. And that's why ethics has to keep constantly water rights, so that what Immanuel Kant said, which I just quoted, saying that ethics means the universality of the duty to show solidarity between human beings. And that right has to stay alive, so that we can indeed enrich it thanks to ethics, and maintain that duty to remain in solidarity amongst humans. The left, which is the custodian of those rights and values, also nurtures those values and rights, and the left has its responsibilities cut out for it. And I just spelled out the left's mission, the duty to help the most vulnerable, the duty to help everyone, and the responsibility to society. The left is there to take society towards a progressive place, which is not based solely on materialism. The left, therefore, has the duty to question itself and to answer some difficult questions, demanding questions, but the questions that cannot be avoided. For instance, how to ensure social ties, how to ensure that we can live together. How does the left guarantee social cohesion in pluralistic societies where there are multiple ties, where there is fragmentation, which is done quietly through allegiances and sometimes exclusive ties, the feeling of being humiliated and prejudice. There is that background work that is undermining the desire to take part in shaping a common destiny. How do we ensure that the general interest triumphs in societies where special interests are taking over and where people are basically trying to impose their worldview, trying to impose their cultural hegemony, trying to force us to see the world the way they want and to accept what they want. How do we rehabilitate the rule of the common interest? How do we put in people's minds the awareness of the common interest? How do we rehabilitate public morality? How do we try to reconcile personal emancipation and a common vision? The left is there to answer that question. That's the condition under which the left will try to push society forward. The first condition is that we have to remember that human beings are not a means, that human beings are an end in themselves, and that human beings are not just there hungry for material beings, but also they're hungry for knowledge, for dialogue, for meetings, and we have to ensure a good circulation of people's wealth and people's ideas, and the left should be there and ensure that all that takes place and keep checking what we're doing. Marty Arsène, the Nobel Prize economist, said we live in a world that is indivisible. He said this, meaning that rich countries can no longer ignore poor countries. Because today, we live in a totally inclusive world. But this indivisible world, we have to constantly have it in mind, in our consciences, because it is this world that can feed our trust in ourselves and also our trust in the others. And it is this that can also remind us of the duty to care for others and to care for ourselves. We can do that. We've shown that through public action where we were in power. We showed it through our activism, and we showed it through our unflagging commitment to our ideas and our values and to our convictions. We've done it, and we know that we can do it again. And we know that we can do it again because we know that we are invincible. And this is certainly what this French poet, André Chédid, did of Egyptian origin, Egyptian and Lebanese origin, when she stated that to do the impossible and to pound the earth, that is being enveloped by fog with our states of mind, that will help to push human beings forward, and that human beings, in spite of all those challenges, are still standing. Thank you very much for listening.
Madame Taubira, merci.
Thank you, Ms. Taubira. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michel Désautels, a CBC journalist. I really appreciate your welcome. First of all, thank you very much, Ms. Taubira, on behalf of everyone. A speech like the one you just made is very important. And given the current news, we have to say that again. What you said is very rich and very generous. Over the next 20 minutes, I will have the opportunity to put some questions to Ms. Taubira. You can also ask questions. We'll be putting on the screen now the URL. I think you're already aware of this process. You can text your questions, and we will put a few to Ms. Taubira at the end of our discussion, if you agree. First of all, Ms. Taubira, you talked about the left's responsibility in many ways. You talked about it in theory, which is great, but in practice, on a daily basis, especially in the political arena, sometimes it becomes very complicated. There are a few governments on the left in Canada and abroad Well, this cannot be CBC president phoning me. Well, I'm just being told that it's time to start. That's it.
Concilier
How do we reconcile the running of government affairs when we're in power and the great ideals such as those of the Socialist Party that you belong to, and ensure that on a daily basis we respect the big principles? There is a gap there, right? Of course. We have some room to maneuver, and you need courage. Yes, there are left-wing governments, but who are we talking about when we talk about the left here? There are different variations on the left. There are many left-wing orientations. So you said that the principles are great. Yes, that's true. And it's our duty to maintain them and to ensure their beauty. And when we're in power, of course, we're faced with constraints that limit the margin we have to maneuver. But those constraints will not mean that we should not work within the limitations we have. We have to deal with our limitations, but we cannot make those constraints worse. And to be able to work within those limitations, you have to keep in mind your values, your principles, and your duties. That's what we must do, because the course of humans so far has been to move forward. When I said that equality is a very modern ambition, well, it's because the more we know, the more we learn, the more we're informed, the more we understand the importance of ensuring that everybody should have access to education, to knowledge, and be able to move around and become modern. And if the left gives up this key ambition that we have to actualize under the current constraints, even when under severe pressure, let's talk about a concrete case. Your resignation earlier this year from the French government on a question of principle, it was about humanity. Maybe I'm putting words into your mouth, but I hope not. The French president, under severe public pressure, maybe also he thought, he wanted to strip certain French citizens of their citizenship under certain circumstances. Before we talk about the principle itself, you realize that this week he had to backtrack on that constitutional amendment because of what the Senate said, and also when he looked at what French public opinion was thinking. Did you say yes? At that point, I have to say yes in French. Yes, it was a matter of principle. It was also a matter of values and symbols. Yes, but we're talking about more than just legislation. That's right. This hit at the heart of the constitutional nature of the Republic, because the French nation is a civic nation. The history of France, of the French battles sometimes against countries that were challenging the republican nature of France itself, the history of the right of nationality and the awareness of belonging to a nationality, histories itself, the historians tie it very much to the battles that France has fought. The first time when there was this feeling of belonging to a nation, whereas the soldiers came from all over, France wasn't yet a unified country, and that's what basically started building the French Republic. And that was what was at stake when you started talking about trying to change the law on nationality, that a French-born citizen could be stripped of their citizenship. That was beginning to question who we are and birthrights and the fact what it means to be born in a country and having a citizenship. That was what was at stake. If that rule could enable us to stop terrorism, well, up to a point, we might accept the perverse consequences or the collateral damage, which would still be huge. We might accept that. but we're dealing with terrorists who blow themselves up. We're dealing with people who, even when they don't take part in criminal acts, burn their passports and basically refuse their belonging to a community. So, in other words, what we've been witnessing in France, for instance, for the last few months, during the discussions that occurred after the several criminal or terrorist attacks, the limitation of French freedoms was still with, the reactions were still within the acceptable realm. But removing people's nationality basically crossed a lot of frontiers. Well, we were wondering if we should have people who have just one passport, or people who are binationals and all that. And I think that was really trying to square the circle, because everybody got tied up in that. But we're not talking about the same thing. We're talking about symbols, we're talking about nationalities and birthrights. Security provisions now. Those were a response to a real danger, because terrorism is a danger. And terrorism is always brutal, because they are hitting targets blindly. They want to create terror. They want to create distress. It's a serious danger. And public authorities are compelled to take steps to protect citizens and take measures to protect people. But that's a major challenge for the left, because the left has to show that they can ensure security. And the left has already done that when it was in power in the past. But to do that, to show that you can protect French citizens and Canadians here, at the same time, the left has to preserve what is most dear to us, that is our individual freedoms. And it is our individual freedoms that are being challenged by the terrorists. Our rule of law, our way of life, the fact that we talk about gender equality and we put that in the law, and that everybody, regardless of their origins and their sexual orientation, their beliefs, that everyone should have the same citizenship rights and the same duties within society. That's what the terrorists are challenging. Are we going to throw that out? No. On the contrary, we should strengthen the preservation of our freedoms, and it's a possibility. You talked about public opinion. Yes. It's normal that people should be scared. It's normal that people should say, protect us, protect us. It's normal for people to say, well, put 3 policemen around me. It's normal. But does political responsibility mean we should all be wallowing in fear? We should say that no. If you're scared, it's normal. It's maybe a sign of that you're mentally healthy. Given what we're facing, we should be scared. But we're courageous as well. Well, Ms. Taubira, you just said that ethics doesn't boil down to a rigid set of rules. Is that why maybe sometimes we will try to promote some ideas and try to come to terms with some ethical shortcuts? Because it's never totally black and white. So in the end, we're actually quite flexible with ethics. We shouldn't be. When I talked about the methods used by the left, I think it's essential to talk about it. I think it's a battle that is unavoidable. In any case, in France, that battle is quite urgent. Here in Canada, I realize that there is some discussion, but one has to live here permanently with you to understand how intense the debate is. But when I say that the left has to discuss and debate, well, we have to go back to that style, because the left is not into Bonaparte's methods where you have a leader and I follow my leader. Nobody can go out of step. You understand that. That's not what the left is about. Well, is there a left-wing leader? Is there a leader on the left? Well, if the left can maintain the debate, well, that would protect the left when it gets to power. The problem with the left is that is when we stop debating, when the left thinks that it knows it all. Of course, it's difficult to fulfill all your responsibilities. We want to do so much, and there are all kinds of limitations that you have to deal with. You have your neighbor who's a good friend, but who disagrees with what you're doing. It's very complicated when you're in charge. But amongst ourselves, when everybody thinks they know it all, and this is the only way, my way or the highway, well, we just can't get anywhere. And that's what often happens to the left when it takes power, be it in France or elsewhere. And the left will just be stuck because it's trying to cut itself off from its grassroots, from its base, and we're no longer nice. And we have to keep encouraging the base, our base. I've traveled around France. I met the French people, and I took questions, and I explained what we were doing. I told them that I would have liked us to do this, but so far we aren't there yet. And I told them, tell us what you think. You have to take that risk and open up the debate. That's what will enable the left to constantly renew its thought and its actions. Towards the end of your speech, Mr. Taubira, you opened an interesting window when you talked about this universe that is indivisible, that we're one as a world. Science has shown that. Maybe we're realizing it a bit late, but when you say this world, that our world is indivisible, that we're all together in this world, well, that brings us to the link between emerging economies and countries that have dominated the world for a few centuries. So does that mean that we should all aspire towards a single humanity? I think so. We cannot avoid that. We can invent all the tricks we want, but the reality is that we're all in this together. Physically, we're together. As you just said, we know that the world is finite. Spatial activity and research and satellites observing the Earth have shown us that physical territory is continuous, that the borders we have are human decisions, that they're the result of history, but that geography is more eternal than history, and physical territory is endless, which means that we're responsible for our little piece of the earth, but we might be imperiling the lives of our neighbors as well as our lives, and vice versa. So we're all in this together because whether we know it or not, we stand together. We're all interconnected. And the consequences of our lifestyle choices will affect everybody. And the implications are considerable. Physical threats, for instance, climate refugees who will be growing in number. That will provoke migration, people arriving from elsewhere, and some territories will disappear, and people will be moving around. When we look at the answers today that are being provided to those who are running away from death, literally, and sometimes die while fleeing from death, from certain death, by trying to cross the sea. When we look at our response to all that, it's lamentable, it's saddening, it's quite tragic, and also it's dangerous. I wonder if the public has sent in a few questions. If yes, maybe somebody can put them on the screen, because we've been discussing for a while, and I would also like to bring the room into the discussion. Yes, a question is coming. And let me point out for everybody here that our discussion, Ms. Taubira's presentation and some of the things that have been happening will also be broadcast on my program tomorrow morning on ici Radio-Canada Première, the French side of the CBC, between 10 a.m. and 12 o'clock. And the whole discussion will be available on the web, so we can all revisit this. I think there is something else to this question. Now, the question is about the universal left, the international left. Does it still exist, or is it fragmented today? Well, it doesn't exist per se, but it's interesting to ask that question now, because I was just saying that the history of the left is tied to the history of social struggles and social victories. And the social struggles have been international. The left, the struggles on the left against the exploitation of labor and the struggle for adequate working conditions and normal working hours, the fight against child labor. It's less than a century ago that was taking place. And we know that even today, there are countries, when I said a while ago that the international community has to codify rights in international covenants, in the UN Charter and elsewhere, well, they shouldn't stop there. They should also ensure those rights are actually respected. So the left has been built through international solidarity. May 1st, for instance, it's international. Meanwhile, there were struggles in various countries to get us there. So we have to get back to that international solidarity. Today, there is so much disorder across the world. Economic disorder, social disorder, cultural disorder, and climate disorders. Why is that? Because we've lost that international solidarity. We're no longer fighting together. Why are some countries especially facing the offshoring of jobs? Meanwhile, they have quality workers, and even when corporations are profitable. Why all the offshoring of corporations? Because we haven't fought internationally for fair wages and fair working conditions and fair working standards.
If we had fought this fight internationally, there would be no possibility for companies to destroy workers here and to exploit workers elsewhere. So the need for international solidarity is more and more evident, especially since the gains we were promised never came about. I have another question here, a bit of a provocative question. Should we fight the populism of the right through populism of the left? Well, what I would say that the left has an alliance with the people. And I wouldn't say the right, but the extreme right, because populism is sliding towards the extreme right. So the extreme right is the mob. The left is the people, and the extreme right is the mob. Why this difference? The left must renew with its reason for being. The reason for being is the protection of the most vulnerable, protecting labor laws, equality. It must renew with that. The left must be the ally, the natural relay for the hopes of progress, the hope for an openness of mind, and a way to eliminate hate. So the left must be the natural ally for these ends. There's a link with the people. And when you are faced with difficulties, you have parties of the extreme right in France and elsewhere in Europe. We see them almost everywhere in the world. So the extreme right exploits the difficulty of people, the feeling of exclusion, of humiliation, the absence of hope. They increase hate. They push people to become furious, and they direct this hate and fury towards the rejection of the other person, rage, intolerance, and that is not the same thing. So the left has this responsibility of coming back to its origins and to listen those who need the power of the state to defend them. But we must not act like the monsters of the extreme right. And the extreme right doesn't know how to use these points of view. Now, questions of solidarity and the public good. I believe you brought this up. Well, that is one of the weaknesses of the left. Well, it's a weakness, and the left must face this difficulty. We must reconcile individual emancipation, and that is something that is necessary. But for a long period of time, there was the Enlightenment in Europe. There was a time of debate, and we often summarize the enlightenment as something serene and so on. But that wasn't the case. For about 100 years, there was a wild debate in Europe. There were all these exchanges between philosophers. So the period of enlightenment was that, a period of huge debate. And the enlightenment is a break with a past that that would control people. Enlightenment was reason, but as Pascal said, there are two reefs to be avoided: admitting only reason or accepting only reason. So reason isn't the only way of acting. Reason means that everyone may envisage and build their own personal future. So the Enlightenment allowed us to fight against the fundamentalism of the past, where we were born, the culture we were born in. So progress is to allow the individual to find himself or herself to become richer ethically, morally, intellectually, and at the same time to join in a common progress, in a common project. Now, the pathology of the period of enlightenment, of that time of the victory of reason, of positivism, mentioned by Auguste Comte, who was an international intellectual. It was a way of thinking that spread out throughout the world, with the conquest of science, science dominating universities, science that promises scientific and moral progress. But the difficulty here is individualism and selfishness. So today we must manage to reconcile this individual emancipation, which is a real progress for the person, with the consciousness of belonging to a community, of having to work together, of having a common destiny, and of getting involved. It's quite a work. Final question. Now, we'd need hours to discuss all of this. What are the possible solutions for marginalized populations in France and in Canada? Well, in Canada, you speak without difficulty of community, and you identify these communities, and you have a relationship between the state and these communities. In your laws, you have certain provisions for this. In France, when you use the word community, everybody gets angry and you can't talk anymore. Now, the way the French state was created on the idea of the abstract idea of the citizen, a citizen who doesn't have a religion, a color, doesn't have a community. So both systems are different. Both systems have their faults and virtues. In France, the great virtue is that usually the republic is blind to any difference in the citizen. The problem is that over time, it became blind to discrimination. It became blind to the fact that there were people who saw increasing difficulties that tore them away from the international community. So that's the great fault of our system, which should not be thrown away, because there's something really useful in this concept of the individual, where the appearance, the religion, the thoughts has no importance, that person has every responsibility, every duty, and every right of all other citizens. But in your federalist system, your political system is federalist, I believe. So their communities have their own identity, their own existence, and that has good points because it recognizes rights, cultural rights, for example. It has virtue because it brings attention to other people who, left on their own, would submit to this exclusion that we know in the more centralized systems such as that in France. But it also has its faults, and the fault is that you allow certain ghettos that they belong to this community can be exclusive. In other words, that it doesn't allow a consciousness of the greater belonging. So I don't think there's a perfect system. We can have ideals and hope for utopia, but I don't think there's one human system that should apply to everyone. That would be scary, actually, because that is total. Mrs. Taubira, as you can see, we have a very attentive audience. So thank you very much in the name of Madame Taubira. And in their name, I would thank you for your generosity. If you ever decide to ask for political asylum in Canada, I think we could grant it because you've been a terrific guest. Thank you, each and every one of you. Mrs. Taubira, thank you.